All right, you okay with the mics? Are they working? Just turned them on. Okay, so Josh said, my name is on Eyre. The president of Ericius Security. Today I'm talking about the collision that happens in physical safety space when digital goes wrong. So let's start. Who am I? Christian husband. That's one actually for me to get on a bio. Yeah. COVID wedding, anybody? President and CEO, as I mentioned. What that also means, and it also means that I do everything, because when no volunteer is available, I have to do the work.
You have volunteers.
I do have volunteers. I have great volunteers, except for Matt. I don't know why we keep that guy around. Former military intelligence officer, former military cyber operations officer, still doing that in the reserves for the next couple months, and then I'm out, free. Done some published research on social network science. I do some informal cybersecurity research, so that's kind of on a back burner lately with everything going on. Love me some Python. You get in a lot of trouble with Python. Open source intelligence is a blast. And then judo is my hobby that I'm so bad at, but I just can't give up for whatever reason. Today's agenda, slide decks have agendas. You guys don't really care about this. How I'm going to frame the talk, though, is who we are, what we've been into, and how that has been changing my perception of the role of cybersecurity as a role that enables other people to succeed. You're not going to hear a huge amount of tech in this talk. There is some. To talk about how joins and relational databases can provide them. Anyone who didn't realize that Zeek is fundamentally a bunch of databases with foreign and primary keys, you're in for a surprise. And we're going to tell a couple stories along the way that I've sanitized. I've kind of brought them down to a terrible level, not only for the sake of NDAs and all that stuff, but for the sake of the violence and whatever else is in them. So I do want to give you kind of a warning in advance. You might encounter some of that if it makes you uncomfortable. No hurt feelings if you want to leave or need to leave. That said, here's one of them. Set the scene in summer of 2018 in Central Europe. There's a woman who's been trafficked, most likely out of Eastern Europe, into Central Europe. And she decides, after being sent on a job and being abused and disfigured on that job, that she's done. She's out. So she runs. She gets on a bus. She gets a hold of someone that then became my client and asks for help. These guys run a small safe house. They've got social workers. They've got counselors. Help women find new jobs after they've been forced into slavery, moved around the world, and landing somewhere away from their family, away from the support network that probably abandoned them to begin with. And she goes there for help. Well, we'll skip over for the moment all the OPSEC and open source intelligence failures that were done, or that led to basically the safe house being compromised. So she's run from a gang that's organized in Europe, and their email, and they figure out where the CEO lives, all this stuff, and they decide that they're going to send abusive image material to the email. Basically says, we know who you are, we know you have her, she belongs to us, you're hurting our bottom line, give her back or more people are going to get hurt. Then the social workers' phones start ringing. And this harassment campaign goes on for a couple days, and then somehow the victim, we don't know how she caught word of it because they tried to keep it all tight to the chest, catches wind of it, flees back, is permanently injured and put in the hospital, and will never look the same again. Why do I tell that story? Not to be emotionally heavy, though it is an emotionally heavy story. It's hard to tell. There are worse details in there, unfortunately. But because when we fail to do things like OPSEC right, we just say use Signal, use Tor, and we talk about this bro mentality, there's consequences to people in the world how to follow that advice when it's not good enough. When we don't do things like blocking loading of external resources, getting someone's IP address off of a safe house can quickly turn into geolocation. Phishing that safe house could be the same thing. So what do we do for the people who are out there alone and unafraid, who are in the field, they're getting their hands dirty, they're trying to help people, and they're too small to have an IT team, they're too small to have a security team, they don't know really what phishing is, much less how to stop it. And they certainly have the funds to hire Mandiant to come save them. Oh, and they're not journalists, so where's Citizen Lab going to be, et cetera. That's not to throw shade on any of those companies, but that there's all of this milieu out there of people just trying to make the world a better place that are not being served. And that's where we come in. We exist to provide cybersecurity support to people serving in dangerous situations. Our goal is to make them more effective at what they do instead of replacing them. I realize that they're not cybersecurity experts. They realize that I'm not an activist. I'm not a missionary. I'm not whatever they are. So we form a relationship, and we make them a better version of what they were. In order to do that, I can't take this InfoSec attitude where I walk in and InfoSec is a means and an ends unto itself. It must fundamentally be part of moving the mission forward. So that's what we do at Ericius. So now it's time to tell some kind of fun stories, some of which are kind of weird. We're going to take a hard right turn into Zoom. In the beginning of 2020, does anyone remember that? That was actually 18, 19 months ago. It wasn't yesterday, believe it or not. So in the Middle East, did anyone in here pay attention to what happened in various repressive Middle Eastern regimes when COVID locked them down too? Anyone see the news on that? VPNs that were legal gray areas were suddenly light gray instead. Tools like Zoom that were banned were suddenly legal. WhatsApp's legal status changed a bunch. Signal's legal status changed a bunch. Next thing you know, you have people who are doing civil rights advocacy, as well as, in my case, Christian missionaries reaching out saying like, hey, these tools are suddenly legal, but the communications department of the government is also saying, don't worry, they're legal, but we can still see everything you're doing. So where's the truth at? What's going on? Well, surely, Zoom is good enough, right? Their white paper said that they were end-to-end encrypted. We won't get too much into what they're doing now, but we'll kind of harp on where they were at the beginning of 2020. Zoom sees this opportunity, they grab this gigantic audience, and they're telling people that they're safe. They're doing end-to-end encryption. So this picture on the left is actually what Zoom was telling people. But in reality, the way they were implementing their crypto was resulting in, I forget exactly what it's called, it's like ECB mode was turned on. So that means that if you encrypted this picture of the Linux penguin with ECB mode on, you can still tell it's the Linux penguin, it's just in grayscale now. That's real good crypto, right? Those of us who've done any kind of crypto know that the pattern should be totally observable. But wait, it gets better because they were doing end-to-end encryption right, so the keys were stealable, which Citizen Lab proved. And what you're seeing on the far right there is that Citizen Lab proved you could intercept the keys, and once you intercepted the keys, you could watch the entire thing. They did have to capture the video and the audio in 2 different channels, though. So what does this mean if you're any kind of person who is just trying to use the tools that are available to get your job done when you can no longer leave your house, and your job's somewhat risky, and the government's saying it's okay, but we can watch you, and then the corporations are saying, don't worry, we've got your back, but actually we don't really care because we're just trying to make money. I won't dig into these 2 vignettes too much, but we basically say that Zoom is not suitable for secrets. The reason we say that is, 1, their crypto sucks. Their architecture is designed to allow them to intercept it whenever they choose to, and then if you need proof of the pudding, they said they'd never do this, and they did. So why am I talking about this? Because purple dragons. Here's DoD. You don't have to raise your hand. But you recognize the purple dragon. It's the OPSEC talk. I checked, unfortunately, the D20 joke. Purple dragon is not one of the chromatic dragons in Dungeons & Dragons, so no such luck there. Might be there. So we're going to talk about OPSEC for a little bit, because this is a lot of what consumed our time in 2020 and quite a bit of our time in 2021. Rule 1, I like to say, is shut up, which is basically the same as loose lips sink ships, but that's not necessarily a tenable position, right? Can you accomplish your mission if you never talk to somebody, especially if you're in a people business? Probably not. Your unhackable computer that's unplugged in the corner in like a safe, great, it's secure, but it's not accomplishing anything for your business. So clearly we have to find an OPSEC model that meets people where they're at. Military, because it doesn't strictly translate. And it can't be unusable. Well, that's not easy. So one of the things we started doing is trying to teach people what does it mean to analyze your operation and to figure out OPSEC from the perspective of operation security being a process that you do to identify the vulnerabilities that are fundamentally tied to your behavior and the mission that you're trying to accomplish. It's a lot about identifying how is it when I do something, how does that advertise who I am, what I'm trying to accomplish, and how can that be exploited? And then even when it's not being exploited, how can that break? But Soapbox, what is it not? It's not use signal, use tool. Okay, those are good tools. But what's the problem with just jumping straight to tools? People and processes are completely removed. I see a bunch of, you can tell who the consultants in the room are, because like, yeah, people, processes, technology, yeah. It's also not blanket advice. It's not never use Facebook, right? It's not never use Zoom, as much as like I discourage the use of Zoom. It's not to say you never can. You can't say WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, you should never touch it. Insert your app of choice. You can't say Proton Mail finally caved to a government, so we can't use them anymore. It's just too complex for that. You also can't say always use open source because, again, the teams you're working with have no IT team. So please explain to me how you're going to deploy Elastic and manage it as everything's changing without someone who even understands what's happening under the hood at Elastic. Also, just kind of silly privacy advice. Like, can we just take a moment to appreciate? This is real advice. It's bottom line. You should never give out your pet's name online. Now, if your pet's name is your password, okay, don't give it out online. But if you're smart enough, like, not to use that as your recovery question or your password, it's okay to let people know. There's a fundamental disconnect, is what I'm trying to say, between what we see on Twitter, between the tech bros and the privacy bros, and what people actually need, particularly outside of the Western world. So this is the framework that we've laid out. It's pretty straightforward. Foundational understanding is just basically how to use a computer, what does OPSEC mean, how to write a mission statement. And I'm going to dig into a couple of these, but I'll hit what they are for the moment. Environmental analysis and threat analysis are about the big four questions of framing what's going on in your area. Where are you? What does that area look like? And how does it impact what you're doing? You'd be surprised that some people have gone into areas that they're trying to help, and they haven't even asked the question about how does where I live impact the work that I'm going to do? How does the demographic that I most interact with lock me out of other demographics that I'm actually trying to reach? Next two big questions, who are your threats? This is where we start attacking the tinfoil because everyone thinks that NSA is their threat. Everyone thinks that the KGB is, I don't know how, KGB is not technically around anymore, but they're out there. They're still the boogeyman, still going to get me. But even more important, once you know who your threats are, how are they going to impact you? And we'll dig into that in just a minute. Then we talk a little bit about operational analysis. If you can't explain what you're doing, then you probably don't know how it's going to break, and you don't know how someone's going to punch you in the face and break it for you. And then we try to get into the most simplified vulnerability management process possible. What could go wrong? Model how it could be possible so that they're actually usable. So where I'm going to dig in a little bit and show you, like, this takes time to go through, and it takes even longer to do. I'm going to dig into part of the analysis. I'm going to dig into vulnerability modeling and vulnerability mitigation. Just hit some wake ups. This slide is not readable, so don't worry about it. The thing that I want to highlight here is identifying threats is a big part of how we do security, just period, whether that's OPSEC or security. If you want a model for how to defend yourself, besides one that's focused on what you have and how it's vulnerable, you need to understand how bad people want to hurt you. Categories of threats, are they state actors, or are they international, lawful, unlawful, how do they want to interact with you? But the big thing that we started discovering here is you talk to people and they're like, I'm working in this country near Saudi. Pick one of the ones in that region. And we think that the secret police are out to get you. Well, secret police probably, but you're small fit. You find control for most people's threats when they're out moving around and they have sensitive cell phones and their laptops. And what do I mean by that? It's not necessarily going through an airport, though that is one of the cases. It's not necessarily actually hitting a Taliban checkpoint. It's, I just got material father thinks is surreptitious or that I shouldn't have on my cell phone home, and because I'm a woman in this environment, I don't have a right to privacy, and my brother took my phone, and my brother's the man, so he gets to have the password to my phone, and he unlocks it, and he sees the material, and now I'm at risk for my life. So the thing we try to drive home to people here is to take the tinfoil hat off. We'll get there when we get there, but also, someone wants to hit you with a missile, they're going to get you. Calm down. Like, not much you can do about a threat that's patient enough and well-resourced enough to get you wherever you're at. What you can do, though, is think about how the person next to you, when you piss them off, is going to harm you or is just going to report you or get upset with you. If you're really going to get on a secret police's radar, it's probably going to be because someone just got motivated to snitch on you. But then even more important than how do I get on that radar and how do I get hurt is how do I push that risk off to someone else? And am I ever doing that to them without their consent or informing them of what's happening? So when I put a pamphlet, when I put a Bible on someone else's phone where it's not supposed to be, did I inform them of what I was signing them up for, what they were signing themselves up for? And did I tell them, hide this in this particular way so that the secret police don't get you, and fail to inform them that their dad is probably really not going to like that? So that's why we talk through identifying threats, is because realistic threats are so much more helpful for building a defensive model and a security model than just, I feel like I'm James Bond and therefore Hydra or whoever's coming after me. I know, I'm mixing fandoms. So skipping over operational analysis, then we get down to vulnerabilities. We try to get, like, these are people that don't understand cybersecurity, not because they're dumb. If you listen to any of the talks that were like about consulting today, it's not because users are dumb, it's because users have built their expertise. Come to them, you've got to bring a model to them that says, I understand what you're trying to accomplish, and I want to make this as usable for you as possible. So naturally, in practice, you're going to be like way over technical and then way under technical, and you're just going to kind of pendulum around until you actually get to something that they understand and are going to use. But kind of walk through a couple examples of how behaviors turn into compromises and different things that could go wrong. So like someone taking a weekly trip to Somerville. Imagine that you're in somewhere in Southeast Asia that has a city named Somerville. Does that make sense? And your whole team in a van, but somehow you want to keep the fact that you're all a team a secret. So imagine the situation where, like, this is a thing I want to keep protected, but I'm going to go get everybody in the same van at the same time, and how that gives away the very thing that you're potentially trying to protect. Information that's used or created by the whole team getting in the van and going to Somerville together, the identity and size of the team. Also, the time of your weekly trip. Think through the assets and tools that you're using. You're using your van, you're using your GPS, you're using whatever else to get there. And what are the ways that it could go wrong? Gas tank, that could be a million different things, right? You could just run out of gas. Someone could actually do something to it. Tire pressure, accidents as well as deliberate sabotage there. And then, obviously, getting spotted traveling together. I'll zip through the next one and go down to tracking the locals with a CRM. This one, unfortunately, is kind of a real case. So imagine like you're out there and you're trying to make contacts with people in a local area. There's a couple different use cases for this. The missionary one is the most straightforward. It's evangelism motivated. The activist one is a little more complicated because sometimes activists want to build grassroots movements. How do you explain to someone with no cybersecurity background the danger of putting all of their contacts for your surreptitious operation in a contact and resource manager so that anyone can find it? Especially when that's an Excel sheet on your unencrypted laptop. One of the ways we try to do that is to get people to think about the information that's created or destroyed or that's used and processed when they're behaving in a particular way. I don't necessarily need to jump them straight to this is how it moves over the wire and this is the type of encryption we use. I need them to understand that by walking down the street, something world around them. And is that something they want to communicate? Is it something they don't want to communicate? We teach 3 types of mitigation controls. mitigating controls, excuse me. Behavior. As cybersecurity folks, we like to jump to the access. That's why we preach end-to-end encryption so much. It's an access control for data in transit. And in certain configurations, it's somewhat of a control for data at rest. Unfortunately, when we preach that, we give people the idea that if I get into an encrypted channel, I can run my mouth, and it will never have any consequences. So something that we try to help people understand is there are two other types of controls out there, at least. This may be oversimplifying the model. But the first is behavioral. Can I change what I'm doing to get rid of the vulnerability altogether? If I don't need port 22 facing the internet, can I turn it off? You know, just because it came turned on Linux by default, do I really need it there? Maybe, maybe not. If I don't need to send that newsletter with everybody's information and all my sensitive operations out to all of my supporters, then I don't do that. Maybe I do need to send the newsletter, but I don't need to include that information. I don't have to worry about protecting information that I don't have, that I don't collect. I don't have to worry about securing information in transit that I don't send. So one of the easiest ways is to go back to loose lips sink ships and say, do I really need to say this thing before I say it? Going back to Russell Eubank's talks of what is essential to getting my mission done, right? Do I need to say this to get my mission done? Or, this is to steal a quote from Robin Dreek, am I doing this to satisfy my ego instead of to lead the team or to accomplish the mission? They're all about people that have access to information. People in this room probably understand those really, really well. It's everything from ACLs to cryptography. But in analysis, things get a little like funky. Because that means assuming breach, how do we make the information unusable to an adversary? And that's very, very hard to do and still keep it simple and usable. So we don't actually see a lot of counter-analysis controls because it's really hard for someone without a lot of resources and time to keep moving forward. That's where. But big takeaways from this: build small and usable mitigations. Like if I try to jump someone from not even understanding that behavior has consequences to like running some super secret squirrel like security stack without the time or money to do that, I'm probably not giving them something that's actually going to get implemented. I can lay out the best plan in the world, but if it's too hard, if it's too unusable, it's not getting put in place. Mitigations that you can remember, particularly when it comes to behaviors, are better than complex solutions. I'm sure all of us have like been in a job somewhere where they're like, this is the whole security process, and you're like, can't remember it, not doing it. And no one says that on purpose, but you get into the moment, and you're like, what was it again? Oh yeah, go out the left door. And they're like, actually it was out the right door, up the stairs, down the stairs, turn around the building 3 times. And then finally, this is something that I personally struggle with. InfoSec does as well, is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We have a really big problem with that at InfoSec. It's that, oh, well, SMS is bad for 2-factor, and yes, it is. But if you're in Africa, it's your only option. Is it better to have no 2-factor or SMS 2-factor? There's a lot of us walking around on the internet being like, well, you know, they could hijack your SIM card, and then where's your 2-factor going to be then? Well, you know what they had to do? They had to hijack your SIM card. And if you had a weak password, without that 2-factor on there, they didn't even have to do that. So going back and stealing some ideas from military philosophy, extending the cost, or expanding the cost that the enemy has to pay, the adversary has to pay to get at you with simple and small things. Tell a couple stories here on consulting. So that's all like OPSEC training side. So then we'll take kind of a turn here and talk about consulting, which is, for us, is teaching people how to build a cybersecurity program where one doesn't exist. It starts with helping people understand the need for a cybersecurity program. A couple ideas up here on the slide that we run into pretty consistently. We don't need a cybersecurity program. If they break in, they can only steal emails. We have monetized cybersecurity to such an extent that people are stuck in a mindset of preventing monetary loss. And when you change the context into a small, altruistic, nonprofit organization, they then see, I don't have any money, so I don't have any money to lose. Therefore, cybersecurity is not a risk. But when you talk about the information in exchange for these guys, It's the location of people in the field. It's the location of local partners. It's people that can get hurt if it gets out. And so you dig in and you kind of help them understand that. So, okay, well, what happens to your operation in Indonesia if this information gets leaked? Oh, well, I have to shut it down and bring everyone home. Okay? So now we have something to protect. It's not something to hide. It's not necessarily money to keep in our pockets. It's people to enable. Developers love to say that they built it right and they configured it right. IT guys say this too. Therefore, it is secure. So how do you know if someone's knocking on your door if you don't have a doorbell and you never listen at your door to hear if someone's knocking? So we've seen a lot of people put up web servers and custom web apps and all this other stuff. And it's secure, we built it right. Also, it's only accessible over port 443, it's running HTTPS, we're good. Never run a phone scanner, never looked at it, and there's certainly no monitoring in place. So now we have to back up and not only understand that there's something and someone to protect, but that there's kind of some simple steps, small disciplines we can start taking in order to keep ourselves safe. The first is, once you build it, then let's start routinely scanning it and checking it to see if it still behaves the way that we think it behaves. Security at its simplest is finding misbehaviors in the system. So if we build the system right, like we said we did, then we probably have documented how it should behave. And we can look for those small departures, and somewhere in those departures of how the correct behavior and misbehavior is the bad guy, if they're there. It's cuckoo's egg level stuff. Another misconception we run into is the money question when it comes to ransomware. So ransomware money, that doesn't mean they don't care about you just because you're broke. A lot of them are also opportunistic. But just because you don't have the $3 million pot to give them doesn't mean they won't take $17,000, empty your bank account, and walk away. Ransomware also is super fascinating. Did you guys ever think, 3-4 years ago, reading about ransomware, you'd be reading discussions about ransomware's business model in 2021? That in 2020 and 2021 that we would see the term ransomware as a service pop up? These guys have better business models than most of us. And their customer service will put most InfoSec people to shame. So they will take what money you have and then either run away with the keys if you're too broke, or put you back online and let someone else come in a different day. What's my point in all of this? There's a mind shift change that has to happen as a security practitioner. You are not here to get your ego off. You are not here to show off how cool and sexy cybersecurity is. You're here to take care of somebody. You're here to make someone else's business function effective. And then, so cheaper than a breach is failing people. If you look at marketing out there, has anyone ever seen that on the internet? Cybersecurity breach. We don't actually say, well, I'm cheaper than a breach. But we say breaches cost people $50 million a year. And I only cost $1 million a year. I don't know about you guys, but my bank account doesn't support $1 million a year or $50 million. So clearly something's got to give somewhere in there. And insert a small talking point about our funding model at this point. One of the reasons we exist is to help the people who can't afford the big companies to do it. So we come in and we try to give a fair rate that's, an actual cybersecurity rate. We come into the bottom quartile every time by design, and it's still sticker shock for most people because their frame of reference is the guy they hired to write the WordPress blog that then didn't get secured for them, and it's not any kind of cybersecurity consulting, much less incident response rates. If you guys have looked at incident response rates on the market, they are prohibitively high for most small, medium companies, much less nonprofits. So then we, small pitch into how we get that done. We then go to our donors and we say, there's a gap between what we want to make so that we can stay alive and what the client can afford because they have no money. So how do we get the client up to where the project should be appropriately priced? Which leads us into one of the things that we do is network monitoring for safe houses. Sometimes call this the itty-bitty MSSP. We've got some other names for it internally that are more fun. But the idea is if you're running a small safe house where protecting the geolocation is part of what your network needs to do, spotting threats that are crossing your perimeter is part of what it needs to do, and then selectively managing the content so that you're not a prison. You're trying to teach people about freedom and get them back on their feet and do self-determination, all these great things. but you don't want certain content, particularly that related to malware, getting through to you or to the people you're housing. So what we do in some cases, this is a very selective thing that we're talking about, we put a managed firewall out there that runs some NIDs and also does some obfuscation and content filtering, and enables us basically to be a layer between them and the internet. And this was designed with that first vignette in mind that I threw out there of when someone sends an email that should have been a phishing email. What have you done? One, to like just turn ATP on in their Exchange server. But because in Office 365, by the way, for those who are unfamiliar, nonprofits can get a discounted rate that can get them ATP. So if you do any consulting, like even just someone's like, hey, I'm a friend, I'm in a nonprofit, what should I do? Turn on ATP if you're using 365, and then if you're in Google Workspaces, they have an equivalent product, go in, make sure it's turned on. But past that level, we come in, we actually do some stuff for them to try to protect that. So this is where we get into some of the tech stuff and UML diagrams and whatnot, not super interesting. But this is how we get it done. So on the left-hand side, we have the stack of log collection. So down on the endpoints, we're pulling logs off disk. We're feeding them up into AWS. AWS S3 using Kinesis fire hoses dumps stuff basically coming straight off those firewalls, straight off those sensors into well-structured S3 buckets, which we can then use Amazon Athena, which is their implementation of Parquet, to read those file structures as if they were a SQL database. So if I'm pulling most cybersecurity data, it's fundamentally well-structured, most of the cases. So I can store it in a well-schemaed relational database and combine it together in different ways. This is where I go with, like, Zeek is actually a relational database and a bunch of text files. On the flip side, though, okay, so we thought about pulling a certain cloud approach and stopping with logs and running decision trees and doing all this machine learning stuff. But then we realized that that's the top of the pyramid of pain, and we have no business being there. Instead, let's get some IOC feeds, and I'll share some free ones for you guys on the next couple slides, and say, like, what if we have two pipes for IOCs? One is analysts have been doing hunting on this data. Let's feed it into the stack from what the analyst decided the signature should be and start creating alerts from that. And the other is let's just pull the free and trustworthy feeds into the system and put them in their own databases and start doing simple matching. And then at our edge, where people are coming out of the system, we can start blocking things that are bad and updating the filter list and the block list. That also, there's some webhook magic in there with Git and whatnot, but it ultimately ends up in a database in Parquet, Athena. And then, for those who aren't familiar, sometimes a NIDS alert is as simple as a SQL join. It's a lot of what's actually happening under the hood in most cases. There's some regex and other nonsense in there. And then that feeds to an analyst who can make a decision on it, and that ultimately can go to, again, the blocking part or the notifying the customer of what's going on. When we talk about some of the things we're interested in researching. Eye chart of a slide. This is just a proof of concept that if I access Tor over it, I can take a feed of Tor nodes and prove that someone is doing that. Tor is a good use case of something that most networks don't need access to unless there's like an actual anonymity case out there somewhere. So yeah, just a simple thing that you can block and also a really easy thing to detect when it happens. In this case, we're matching based on a known list of Tor nodes, but Tor's network signature in most cases is, like by default, is really easy to spot as well. So we have another hunt, we can just use all that stuff straight up to the surface. Some free feeds. I'll pause here if you guys want to take a slide. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. There's a lot of noisy stuff out there too. If you've ever used emerging threats open rules, they are great and they are not tuned. If you want reputational information, check out Umbrella's Top 1 Million. Snort puts out a good IP block list. Dan.me has like 5 or 6 different great sets of like just informative lists. Everything from Tor lists to bad reputation scan. A lot of similar information, so does blocklist.de. To a free IOC feed for phishing, check out OpenPhish. And then SANS, that should be ISC, yeah, Internet Storm Center, pardon that, has a bunch of stuff as well under the tools and data sections of their website. So you don't just have to listen to their podcast, you actually get their data too. Where I'm going with that, and then we'll kind of land the talk here. Coming back to use cases that InfoSec is not handling well. Stalkerware in 2020 saw a huge spike in use in domestic abuse cases. Where this overlaps with me is I'm concerned with anti-trafficking. Control of accounts is one of the #1 ways to monitor a victim of anti-trafficking. The handler, otherwise known as the pimp, will control access to the Google account, will control access to the phone. They don't need Stalkerware because they can just open the phone and read what's going on. They can track my iPhone, whatever, and see what's going on. But as we see this increase in domestic abuse, which shares TTPs for control and monitoring, we can reason that it will eventually find its way into the anti-trafficking space. So clearly the info is tied to people being harmed already in domestic abuse space and may be tied to more harm in the future. Well, unfortunately, this is an area that we're totally missing the mark on. Previous research going back to as early as 2018 that I can find at this point basically shows that if you put this stuff in a VirusTotal, if you put this stuff in any kind of virus scanner, they will almost always come back clean. These are the manufacturers of 4 different types of stalkerware. And you can see there's 86 detection engines in VirusTotal's Community Edition by default. And only 2 of these distribution domains, malware distribution domains, get flagged as any type of suspicious. And if you were to squint at the slide, you would see that the worst that any of these get labeled is potentially unwanted program. That's adware. That's not that bad. I mean, it's annoying. It could be used to serve malware, but it's just adware. And then even worse, most of these are IT tools or mobile communication tools. You have a whole segment of commodity malware out there that's being treated like it has legitimate purpose, even as companies like Google, and then a lot of the human rights organizations, EFF's actually on board with this, with Stalkerware Coalition, are saying like, this is bad, this is being used to literally hurt people. We've got to stop doing this. And the InfoSec community, just like, nah, telecommunication tools. In their defense, though, some of the actual APKs and whatnot involved in this do flag a little bit higher. I think the highest I saw out of any of these, though, was like 36 out of 86. So they're still under a 50% detection rate for like the actual binary doing the dirty work. There is some good news, though. Their C2 sucks. It sucks, it really does. So these guys do not do anything to obfuscate. Once it's installed on the machine, it's typically running as a background service. And from there, they're like, we're not malware, we have nothing to hide. No one thinks we're malware, we don't need to do this. So what that means is the command and control server is often provided by the service owner. What that means is their C2, one, is arrogant, and it's really, really obvious. It's like spotting signal on a network if you're running a PCAP, super clear. Self-provided C2 actually means that the distribution domain is often the C2 domain. So if I can figure out who's making it, I can figure out how to spot it on NIDs. We've also got some IOCs for the actual binaries and whatnot. So this is an example of some IOCs we've collected for the community, Excel table and whatnot. Port this up into our cloud NIDs, and then we can see when we simulate traffic across it, because they're using their own domains, we can spot it really simply. And then also, if you wanted like a one-stop shop for tracking stalkerware on the wire, watch domain name, DNS requests for the word spy. And just put like an asterisk on either side of that. You will find so much of these guys because they're so just like, what, we spy on people, what's wrong with that? Well, fortunately for us, we can find it and we can block it really easily. And then some of them actually have obfuscated names. Yeah, coming close to the end of the time. So I'm going to stop there. I've got more stories to share if you guys want more. You can come talk to me afterwards. It's kind of security, and it was taken, so we turned it into Latin, and we're still here. Things that we need, though, right now we're doing a lot of consulting to do with volunteers who don't have time during the day, because your clients need to see you when they're. We need to look at applications and networks, not just people in Facebook stalking. OPSEC, we need people who can communicate. Could really use a volunteer coordinator. And then obviously financial investors. For those curious, we are a 501c3 if you are so inclined. So I'm going to stop here. I do have some giveaways, and I would love to take your questions. So the full calls. The most rewarding thing that we've seen is when someone picks up a security, like themselves. So we saw like the story about the woman who was harmed, completely transformed security. They just recently started a new online. As more trafficking has gone online, they've kind of followed it for their like intake funnel. And instead of being like, hey, we're doing this, now let's go bolt on some security, they've now switched into this idea of like, this needs to be in the design process. And in that regard, they're actually showing more maturity than some like software development teams. So. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So we no longer do pro bono work, but we do highly subsidized work. What we learned is, this is the lifestyle story, is people that receive work for free don't typically care about it till they're scared. And security requires people to put in work up front. So all that said, we do stuff that's very highly discounted, down to almost free, but we don't do completely free. And we do mostly work for other nonprofits and missionary organizations. My two most active projects right now are missionary organizations, and then I've got two ongoing reoccurring things with small anti-traffickers, one in Europe, one in the United States. And then looking at my upcoming projects, I've got a couple more missionary ones in the pipe, and then I've got a couple for-profit sustainability ones. And that's the other side of how we do funding. Some for-profit work to make that risk margin by like taking people who can't afford to pay what the project is worth on. We go like do some for-profit stuff. We don't take home all that money. It stays in the bank so that we can continue to do work when people can only pay $5 a month. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I look for 2 hours a week as kind of the minimum commitment. It sounds like a lot, and well, actually I think it sounds like a little bit, but it's usually a kind of high bar for people to actually hit, but we want them to average there instead of, that always be the case. And then for the consultants, we really need people who can jump on something last minute and do background research at a minimum. So anywhere from 8 to 10 hours a month, averaging out somewhere around 2 hours a week. For people who end up on the NIDS project, it can be a little bit lower because it's more asynchronous, and it can kind of just keep pushing the ball forward without having to be involved in like actually working with clients. So. Yes, sir. Yes and no. So we've done that once so far, and it worked really, really well. We plan to do it again in the future. Where we're at with the internship program is figuring out what maturity level we need. And frankly speaking, when it comes to like leading a client engagement, most college kids aren't quite ready for that yet, but they still can be helpful by being on those calls and helping do some of the writing and researching. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is it's in progress, and so not quite yet. But hopefully by the time next summer break rolls around, we'll have our stuff together for that.
Have you guys been targeted after an engagement or working with an organization?
We have not yet, fortunately. And I think part of that is a factor of being in the background and working for those organizations instead of like being out actually doing the work ourselves. So after down and grab one of these two. Simple answer, we've been fortunate so far. Okay, and then let's